about today is Grand Canyon ecology. And the outline of what we're going to go over today are, we're going to talk about life zones or biotic communities. They're sort of interchangeable, the different ways you speak about them. Then we're going to talk about how the plants and animals adapt to this really harsh, dry, arid environment in the Grand Canyon. And then lastly, we're going to look at two symbiotic relationships, meaning that plants and animals help each other out. So they're both helped by the other, so they have some pretty interesting relationships to mutually be beneficial to them. So that's what we're going to talk about today as we sort of go through some ecology of the Grand Canyon. And we're going to start off then about life zones. That was brought about by C. Hart Merriam, who's one of our first ecologists. And so we'll see him and talk about his study that he did with life zones, which now we more equate to biotic communities. And then once we do that, we're going to travel through those biotic communities, starting from the bottom of the Grand Canyon, and then going all the way up to the rim and even above the rim, which we'll get into in a bit. And I know some of you had plans to go to the Grand Canyon. In fact, you would have already been there. So that didn't happen with our change rule this year. And so I'm going to hopefully give you a little taste of the Grand Canyon and some more knowledge about the canyon so you can virtually get some connection with the canyon while we're going through this pandemic. So here is C. Hart Merriam, a photo of him. And he not only was one of our first ecologists, but he brought to light important ecological concepts, mainly looking at the reasons why, not just, he did a big mapping project we'll talk about in a minute over where plants and animals were in this area, but he looked into why they were there, which is what ecology really starts looking at, is not just what you see, but why things are where they are. And this work we'll talk about, it was really the cornerstone for the beginning, budding ecological science. It was just beginning with him. And so what he did is he came in 1889, so what, just less than 30 years after the Civil War, 20 years after John Wesley Powell explored the Colorado River through the Grand Canyon. So 1889, he came with a small crew to the base of the San Francisco Peaks. So these are the San Francisco Peaks, which are just north of Flagstaff, towering north of the Flagstaff area. And they set up camp for a good amount of time, weeks and into months, with their horses and such. And they chose this area because here in the background, I'm expecting you can see my little arrow I'm showing you. So here are some of the San Francisco Peaks. The highest ones are at about 12,000 feet in elevation. If you go 80 miles north of the San Francisco Peaks area, the Flagstaff area, and get to the bottom of the Grand Canyon, that elevation is 2,000 feet. So within just 80 miles, less than 100 miles horizontally, I mean, distance-wise, you can get to a difference in elevation of 10,000 feet. Of difference in elevation. And that's why he chose here, because he wanted to see as he went up and down in elevation how things changed. And so here, you know, what he found out and wrote about was as you go up in elevation, and this was known in some respect, but he really very carefully mapped this and solidified it. As you go up, let's say 1,000 feet in elevation, it's going to start getting cooler. And where it starts getting cooler, it starts to rain and snow more. And so the precipitation is more as you go up in elevation. Pretty much every 1,000 feet, you get cooler, about 4 or so degrees cooler. Then you go up another 1,000 feet, it gets that much cooler too. So he talked about that. And with that precipitation was the reason why he found these differences in what he called life zones or plants and animals. And that we all know at some different level, hopefully intuitively, as we walk about the earth and figure things out. But the other thing he noticed and talked about, which is pretty interesting, is if you go up in elevation 1,000 feet, it's similar to staying at the same elevation, yet going up in latitude about 300 miles. So if you're at the bottom of the Grand Canyon, you're going to see plants and animals that are similar to more southern latitudes, such as Mexico. Then as you go up further up in elevation, you'll see more plants and animals you find in the continental United States. But as you go even further up, another few thousand feet, you're going to see plants and animals that you'll find in much farther northern latitudes, such as in Canada. And so that's also one aspect of his life zone concept. And so here's a simple diagram of a mountain. And here on the left, you'll see the different zones he talked about, the lower Sonora and the upper Sonora, and that's the Mexico, also the southern Arizona. They even have little cacti there and such. But as you go up higher, then you get into the transition zone, which has a ponderosa pine forest. And then you go even further up, you'll get into the Canadian zone and Hudsonian zone as you get into plants and animals you find more in Canada. And so that's, you know, the main emphasis of what his mapping and what his ecological focus was when he was looking at these life zones. So I'm going to take that concept of life zones and we're going to move to the Grand Canyon. So this is a diagram I put together showing a cross section of the Grand Canyon. So here's the south rim. Here's the canyon going down from the south rim to the river. Here's the canyon coming up to the north rim. And there's a couple things I'm going to point out here. There's a riparian zone, riparian environment at the very bottom where the river is. Riparian means riverside or streamside vegetation. So we'll look into that. And then you go up in these different, but you notice I'm not talking about zones anymore. Zones are a good idea and a good concept, but it's not like the animals and plants just stay in certain zones. Some move around, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But also there's other factors that are than just precipitation that Miriam talked about. There's also aspect. So here is the south rim. This part of the slope of the canyon then is facing north. On the north rim, this part of the canyon is facing south. So the south facing slope is going to get a lot more sun. So the desert plants are a little bit higher up on that south facing slope. That's why this line isn't straight across, because on the south facing slope it's warmer. So desert plants are higher, and the next layer of plants are higher too. And so that's important, what direction the slope is facing. There's also what type of soil is there. If there's some soil that works better for some species versus other. There's also how cold the winter gets, how long that winter season is. And so and then riparian, they're not just at the bottom, they can be in all sorts of environments where there's water, so that doesn't have as much to do with just elevation. So there's sort of more nuances to it. So a lot of people focus on not just the zones, but talk about different communities. And that's how I'm going to talk about as we work our way from the bottom of the Grand Canyon to the top. So we'll start down at the bottom. And even though you didn't get to go to the Grand Canyon, if you had gone, you wouldn't have been able to hike from the bottom of the canyon to the top anyway, I think in your short time. So we'll get to do it today. So we're going to start at the bottom. So this is along the Colorado River. This is in the Nankoweap area. And just notice how sparse the vegetation is in the desert slopes here versus right near the river. You see all sorts of plants just growing right along the edge there, because they have the ability with their roots to get all that water and, you know, grow very profusely along the river. So that's our riparian environment at the bottom of the Grand Canyon. You'll find that along the river, but also in springs. So this is Basie's paradise in the Grand Canyon, where water just comes pouring out of the red wall cliff here all the time. And so once it hits soil, you'll have huge amount of plants and animals also living in these types of environments. And if you get up close to them, you're going to see moss and maidenhair fern, just really delicate plants just along in these river riparian environments. Also, this is Cardinal monkey flower, really beautiful flower right by the creek. You see the creek water here. So those are some of the plants you'd see along the riparian environment. Once you get a little further away, that's when you really get into the desert environment. So here we have the prickly pear cactus, some brickle bush off to the right. And then some of you may know this when you visited the Grand Canyon or been into Arizona. You've got the century plant or agave. And you can tell it's century plant if you don't know it very well. Look at those spikes on the sides of its leaves. That's your big clue that it's a century plant. And a little bit about this plant is so interesting. I just want to go through this a little bit. These plants will grow similar to what you see right there for 15, 20, 25 years. All the while, they're going to collect more and more sugars into the base of the plant. And finally, after all those years, they'll have enough energy down there that they're going to shoot up a big stalk one spring. So here's an example of a stalk that's growing. This one decided to go for it this year. It's growing this stalk. Here's one that's full grown. It gets very tall. You can see with the people there how tall it can get. And it grows, it puts all of its life energy into that growth, into that stalk. And it can grow, those bigger plants like these ones can grow 10 or so inches a day, just continuing to grow that stalk. And because they put all its life energy in it, once they do that, they have these beautiful flowers here that the insects visit. The whole plant will die. So this is one that's growing. This is one in full bloom, except the flowers haven't come out, they're yellow. This is one that grew last year, so it's dead. So really interesting plant, century plant that you'll find throughout the Grand Canyon in southern Arizona. Also in the desert scrub area, you'll find yucca. Looks kind of like century plant, but you'll see these fibers coming off the side. So that's your easiest clue to know that it's not century plant or agave, it's yucca. And these, of course, are different species of yucca. There's several in the canyon. This one, it has a stalk that comes out in the springtime, not every spring, but lots of the springs with these beautiful white flowers. The stalk will die, but the plant will continue on year after year, growing new stalks in other springs. So that's another nice desert plant to know about. And we would be remiss if we didn't bring up, they're not very exciting looking, but here on the Tonto platform of the Grand Canyon, there's millions and millions of black brush and this sort of grayish bush that you'll see as you're going along the Tonto Trail there. So those are very common plants along partway up in the desert scrub area on the Tonto platform. Some of the animals you'll see, of course, there's lots of lizards, and here's a Grand Canyon pink rattlesnake that was there last month. Also, some of the lizards are pretty amazing. Some of them you'll recognize from here because I know I've seen a collared lizard here around in Grand Junction. This is one from the canyon, and they get very colorful in the spring when during mating season. And then some of the mammals, just like you have in Grand Junction, we have desert bighorn sheep throughout the inner canyon. So it's a pleasure to see those down in there too. As we go up a little further, then go up higher in elevation, we move out of just the desert scrub and go into the pinion juniper woodland. And these you're really familiar with because you have pinions and junipers throughout your area. So pinion, and we'll get into the pinion cone and that symbiotic relationship towards the end. And then of course the Utah juniper with scale-like needles and the juniper berries. And we'll continue going up. Now we're at the south rim. If it's a little further away from the rim, you'll get into the big ponderosa pine trees. They're right on the edge of the north rim. And they're also surrounding Flagstaff, real important trees for lumber years past and very fire resistant. And the best thing about them for us is the squirrels that frequent them. So this is the Abert squirrel on the south rim. And also around Flagstaff and other ponderosa pine forests. That's one type of a tassel-eared squirrel. And this is, of course, our favorite on the north rim, found nowhere else. The Kaibab squirrel. This is a squirrel that my dad studied and my mom's husband studied in the 60s and 70s. And in fact, this is a photograph he took. So we get to see it a couple times in this talk because we're going to go back to those squirrels in a little bit. So the Kaibab squirrel on the north rim. Whoops. Once we go even higher up on the north rim, remember that north side is higher. You get into above the ponderosa pines, you get into spruce, Engelmann blue spruce, and white fir, subalpine fir, also aspen trees. Here's some mule deer in the foreground. So just beautiful forests of those higher elevations. But then we run out of high elevation there, so we're going to zoom over to the San Francisco peaks outside Flagstaff and get into the even higher elevations where you're going to see, bristlecone pine you have here, some low-lying shrubs, limber pine. Eventually you get even above tree line and find just the real low-lying plants. And some of these are ones you would find more commonly in the Canadian area in the Canadian or Hudsonian zone that Miriam talked about. So we sort of very quickly, more quickly than if we were hiking, got a taste for all these different types of communities at the bottom of the canyon and even above, way up on the San Francisco peaks. Some don't stay in certain communities, some are throughout them all. One of them is the common raven, and they're at the bottom, they're in the middle, they're on the top of the canyon, they're at Flagstaff, they're just everywhere in the region. And some of you may recognize this guy. If you're really lucky in the canyon, you get to see the California condor. And so they were, you know, there was just a few in the 1980s, and they collected them through captive breeding, brought their numbers up, and then released them into the wild in 1996 in the canyon. So they are flying around. They all have radio telemetry. You can see that. They have started nesting and hatching and fledging birds. And so they do fly in the canyon. They're twice the size of an eagle, so it's quite exciting to see them, but they'll be, again, like the raven, at the top, in the middle, and the bottom, depending on the weather and such. And then the most seen of all, I think that is throughout the canyon also, is the rock squirrel. You'll see him at Phantom Ranch. Here's Indian Garden partway up. Here he is at the rim. So he's throughout the canyon. So some of the animals are throughout, and some of the plants also have a really wide range, and others are very specific. So that just gives us a little bit of an overview of the biotic communities, the plants and animals at the Grand Canyon. So I'm not sure, would you like to ask any questions now in the end of this first section, or should we just wait to the end? If anyone has a burning question, raise your hand and I'll unmute you all. Otherwise, we'll move to section 2. I don't see any raised hands, so we'll just move on to the next section. So what we're going to talk about now is how some of the plants and animals adapt to what's a very harsh, dry, and hot environment in the canyon. We're going to talk about plants, and then we're going to talk about animal strategies. And so the Grand Canyon, here I am not at the bottom of the canyon, because in the late spring and early summer, it gets darn hot down there. There's many days this past summer that it was 115, 120 down at Phantom Ranch, down at the bottom where the river is. So here's a summer picture where I'm not at all wanting to be down there. I'm enjoying relaxing at the top where it's 20 degrees cooler. But it gets really hot and really dry in the summer until about early July. Then we get our monsoon season. And we have moisture coming in from the Gulf of California and Gulf of Mexico, and gigantic clouds just dumping in a real patchwork fashion, but dumping rain, sometimes very profusely, with huge raindrops just pelting the ground, which you get a feel from that in this photo. And imagine, think about how much of that water is going to be absorbed in this tilted, rocky terrain here. Not too much. So some of it is absorbed in the soil. A lot of it just starts eroding the canyon and flash floods down to the river. Here in this photo, the river is brown as the canyon's eroding. And so the plants and animals are there. They soak up what they can, but a lot of that water, which is about half of the precipitation, half is in the monsoon summer and half of it's in the winter. A lot of it runs off and erodes the canyon, and the plants can't get as much as would otherwise happen if it were a more gentle, consistent rain. So we do have a good amount of the monsoon rains in the summer. Then in the fall, it starts drying out. We have the beautiful Indian summer, which is great for hiking, but not so great for plants trying to get moisture then. And we do have winter snows, and oftentimes it'll just rain a little bit less in, not snow, but rain in the bottom, but much less than on the top. But the snows, since they come at winter, a lot of the plants, the annuals are already gone by then. And a lot of the plants are dormant and they're not doing much. So they can't make as much use of it as they otherwise would in the middle of the growing season. So that's why it's tougher for the plants to live and animals to live in this type of environment. So we'll look at how they do. And here's just a photo of the dry, harsh conditions there. We're going to start looking then at how these plants and animals live in this type of environment. So first we talk about annuals. So they just get it over with quick. They They germinate, they grow, they reproduce, they die all before the summer gets too hot or all before the summer monsoon season ends. And just get your life over with quick, and then you don't have to deal with all those hot, dry conditions. So that's one strategy. Another one is you won't have these big floppy gigantic leaves. You'll have more often these smaller, compact leaves. They're more waxy. They sometimes have lighter color to them or hairs on them that just help protect them from losing too much moisture through the leaves. So you'll see much more compact leaves, thicker leaves in these types of environments. Or you're not going to see all those big deciduous trees so much. You're going to see a lot more pine trees, because pine needles live about 3 or 4 years or so before they drop off. The oldest ones drop off, the new ones grow, but they live several years in the process versus a deciduous tree that dumps all its leaves, grows a whole new set of leaves. And then, that takes a lot of energy and water to do that. So you'll see pine trees like pinions and juniper here in these harsher, drier, less nourishing type environments. Then you get the cacti. So here's another prickly pear. And these cacti, imagine right below the surface, radiating out in all directions, are the roots. And they will, as soon as it rains there, the roots are right by the surface, so they'll take up as much moisture as possible, and they'll store them in these pads here. So you can actually see the pads getting thicker right after a big rainstorm. And they'll hold on to that moisture. They can go for months without any rain and just use the moisture that they have. Another thing that the cacti do, this prickly pear cactus does this, and the century plant that we already talked about does this, they have a different type of photosynthesis. Their photosynthesis is called CAM photosynthesis, which stands for crassulacean acid metabolism. And what that means is they just do it differently than the average plant. They will, in the nighttime, they're going to open up their stomata, which are the holes in their leaves, to do their gas exchange at night. Because at night it's not so hot, and as they open up their stomata, you lose moisture through that process. And if you're going to lose less moisture because the holes in your leaves, those stomata are open up at night. So they do their gas exchange then. They take in CO2, they take out oxygen, balancing everything with us. But they can't continue the rest of the photosynthetic pathway because they need light. And so they'll hang on to that the gas exchange, and then they'll do part of the pathway then, and then store a type of acid, malic acid, until daytime. Then at daytime, when there's light, they can continue the photosynthetic pathway, and with that, turn the sunlight energy into sugars that they can use for themselves. So rather than doing the whole thing in the day like other plants, they do the gas exchange at night, so they lose less moisture when it's not so hot, and then do the second half of it during the day when they have light. So a really interesting way, just a different way to do photosynthesis. Then there's some plants, this is the four-winged saltbush, and some species have female and male parts on the same plant, and some species are either female or male of a plant. And so this species is either a female or a male four-winged saltbush. This one's a female, and if you look close, you'll see all these are the wings. There are 4 of them, which gives it its name, and at the base of them are little seeds. So that's, and you'll see these fruits that you can tell that this is the female four-winged saltbush. But it takes a lot of water and energy to make all these seeds. So on particularly hard years, these female four-winged saltbush will turn into male four-winged saltbush, because then they just need to make pollen, which takes a lot less energy than it does to make all these seeds. Then there's this plant. So you have this around here also, the Mormon Tea or ephedra. They don't have leaves to photosynthesize with. They use their branches, which are sort of look like those little twigs there. So again, they're really conservative with water by using those branches. But look at that bush for a second. Think about how old do you think that plant is? And maybe you come up with a number, you go, I don't know, maybe it's 20 or 30 years old, something like that, because it's just a bush, right? But it's pretty amazing how long-lived these plants are. And we discovered this a few decades ago with this experiment that occurred. And in 1989, so 30 years ago, some geologists wanted to compare some photographs in their current year with 100-year-ago photographs. In 1889, the Stanton expedition was a river trip that went through the Grand Canyon, took hundreds of photographs of the Grand Canyon for the purpose of looking at the feasibility of putting a railroad right along the Colorado River in the Grand Canyon. So they took all these photographs to see if they should get a railroad along the river. Luckily, that didn't happen. There's no railroad following the Colorado River, but they do have all these photographs from 100 years ago. So these scientists in 1989, so 100 years later, wanted to, for the purpose of geology and see how the Grand Canyon has changed in 100 years, they did another river trip for science, and they took the same type of camera. They went down the same time of year. They went to the same places, took the same photographs, and tried to do it during the same time of day if they could. And so they have hundreds of reproductions of the exact same spot to compare geology in the canyon, but they inadvertently learned something about biology too. So here's a photo of a ruin, a hilltop ruin, the Cardinal ruins, and you can see there's bushes surrounding this ruin. So these two bushes, which are Mormon Tea, are right here. These two are right here. And these ones right here are down here. So in 100 years, the bushes, the Mormon Tea looked pretty much unchanged. Sometimes in some of the photos, they can see the exact same branch on the same bush 100 years later. So if they look that similar in 100 years, just imagine how old they might be, hundreds of years old. So these Mormon Tea, also wolfberry does this, and there's some other plants too. They just eke out this very conservative living, growing slowly, hanging on there, year after year, decade after decade, 100 years after 100 years. So some of them just do a phenomenal job living in this harsh environment. Let's look at animals a little bit. So here we have a Triops through the water. This is in a pothole. So a lot of times we'll get water coming in the spring or in the monsoons, filling up potholes in the slick rock. When that happens, the soil at the bottom of the pothole gets wet. These eggs hatch. The Triops come out, look like this. They're a lot like fairy shrimp. They're similar to that. Kind of look like pollywogs, but they're more like fairy shrimp. They grow, they mature, they reproduce, and then they lay eggs, and then they die, all while that pothole is evaporating and getting smaller and smaller and smaller. So they do that before it dries up. And then they, just like those annual plants, they just get their life over with quickly and are out of there by the time the water's gone. So that's one strategy, just get it over with fast. Other ones are behavior. So a lot of animals, unlike us, if you go to the Grand Canyon in July, you're going to see a lot of people hiking around in the middle of the day. A lot of animals know better in that they will stay in their dens or stay under cover or stay in the shade. These guys will be in their dens, and then the coyotes will come out at night when it's cooler. It's a lot more reasonable time to be out there when it's 100 whatever during the day. So you use your behavior. The birds will do the same thing. You'll see them more often out when it's not so hot. The early morning hours is the most likely time. Also, birds have a different temperature. Our temperature is usually 98.6. Birds are 104. So they don't feel hot as easily as we do because they're already hotter in the first place. So it's just one little strategy that helps a little bit. And then the lizards are just the kings of survival in really hot environments. And they do that in a different way too. We mammals are endotherms, meaning that we have an optimal body temperature and we use our metabolism to keep ourselves at that body temperature. So we, make more energy, we shiver, we do different things to make us 98.6. These lizards, different reptiles, are ectotherms. They have an optimal body temperature too, but they don't use their internal metabolism to get them to that temperature. They use external sources. That's why they're ectotherms versus endotherms. So in the morning, they want to warm up. So what do? They go to the sun. They just lie and bask in the sun to warm their bodies up to the optimal temperature. If they get too hot, they'll go into the shade. So rather than use all that energy to internally keep them the right temperature, they use much less energy. In fact, their metabolism is 1/7 hours. So they need much less food and they need much less water because of their being ectotherms. And I would be remiss also if I didn't mention some current changes going on there too. Yes, these plants are very well adapted to the heat and the dry conditions, but they do need water. And so last month I was on a backpack trip into Nankoweap where we saw that first photo with the river. And different places along the trail, we saw some of these plants looking really bad off. This is on a shelf. These two ones up top were on a shelf, right, as before you drop into the creek on the trail. And here's some prickly pear, and they look like they're dying or already just too far gone to survive. And there's just right along the trail, this was a big bench, and we saw many, many of these prickly pears. And here's the ephedra. Remember how green they looked? And here they just looked so, I'm not sure if this one's going to make it. Then you wonder how old this plant was, you know, and maybe this is its last year. And even down here, here's some century plant. Here's the trail. This was in a section that had huge redwall cliffs on either side. But even with that shade of the redwall cliffs, you can see that they're really starting to die out. So they can do really well in dry environments, but as our earth is warming and getting drier in these places, we're seeing a fair amount of extreme stress or death. And it was very sad to see that firsthand while I was going down there last month. So that's a little bit about how they do in that type of environment. So we're going to move into the last section, which is two different symbiotic relationships, some relationships on how plants and animals help each other out in their environment so that they're doing pretty well just in facilitating that relationship. So we'll look at pinions and jays, and then we'll look at a three-way relationship between trees, bacteria, and the tasseleared squirrels. So again, we got our pinion pine, we mentioned already. They're pine cones, which you have here. So every few years, you're going to have a bumper crop of pine cones, and you'll see throughout the region, all the trees were laden with these pine cones. There'll be hundreds on some of the bigger trees. And we had that this year. I don't know, did we have that in Grand Junction also? Did you see that in Grand Junction?
I didn't notice it.
Yeah, my mom didn't notice it. Did anyone nod their head or shake their head? Did that happen here? Maybe not so much. But in Arizona, it did. So every few years, they'll have this bumper crop. You'll have these big pine nuts. We humans have eaten them for centuries or even more than 1,000 years. The birds really like them too. And the main birds that like them are the jays. So we'll have the scrub jay, Steller's jay, pinion jay, and Clark's nutcracker. The scrub jay is the least specialized in what it will do. It will take some of the pinion nuts, and of course, first they eat some because they taste so good. But then he'll take one in his bill, he'll fly a little ways away, and he'll cache it in the ground. Then he'll come back and take one other pinion nut, fly a little ways away, and cache it in the ground. The pinion jay and Clark's nutcrackers are the most specialized in doing this. And so these guys actually have what's called a sublingual pouch. Their esophagus has a section that can expand into this huge pouch. And you've all seen pinion nuts. They're pretty big. They're sizes of a peanut kind of outside of the shell. They can put 40 or 50 of those pinion nuts in their sublingual pouch and then fly away and cache a whole bunch of them at once in the ground and come back, and so that they're much more efficient at doing that. Also, look how long their bills are. Both these guys can open up those pinion cones before they're even ripe, when they're still green. So they could get to them before these guys can. So they're much more efficient at getting the, sneakily around, getting them before those guys can, and then caching a whole bunch of them. So these guys come late winter, early spring, when there's not much food around, they somehow remember where they cached those pinion nuts, and they will retrieve them and eat them then. And they've done experiments to see, they're thinking, well, maybe they have some clues to figure out where they cached them. But we've done experiments where even there's a grid system at NEU in Flagstaff where a professor had a Clark's nutcracker, and he'd have a whole bunch of pinion nuts, and the Clark's nutcracker would cache them in this grid system. Then he'd take the bird away, he'd take the pinion nuts away. Months later, he'd put the bird back into that grid system, and that bird would go to all the correct grid spots where he cached them. There's no clues because there's no pinion nuts there anymore, but he remembered where he did that. The professor even tested that against his graduate students. So he'd have the birds test, see how well the birds would do, then he'd have his graduate students cache pinion nuts in the same grid. You can probably guess who did better, which would be the bird. And so he'd laugh about his graduate students, but I noticed he never really tested himself either, because I don't think he would have done even better, even though he really likes those jays. So they remember where they cache them, they have a food source, so obviously that helps the bird out. So how does it help the tree out? Think about it a little bit, and you probably already have an idea. I'm too scared to unmute and mute you, so we'll just talk at the end of this, because I may destroy this whole talk if I do that. But the trees, not all of them are going to be retrieved. So a lot of the pinion nuts, they'll retrieve, but other ones they either don't need or maybe they forgot. And so those ones that aren't retrieved are literally dispersed away from the tree, stuck into the ground, and left there to potentially germinate and turn into a tree. So they're dispersing the seeds for the tree, planting them in the ground for the tree, and if they don't retrieve them, then the tree has a better chance of moving on and growing in different areas. Because of that, if you look at the pinion, here's a pinion cone with the nuts in it, you'll notice that some of the nuts are lighter colored and some of them are darker colored. The lighter colored are called aborted seeds. They didn't develop properly and they're hollow inside. There's nothing inside of those seeds. The darker ones have the normal pinion nut in them. So here are these visual birds that can look down, and they're not going to pick out those lighter colored hollow ones. They just pick out the darker ones that are visually distinct from the other ones and not take a bunch of hollow seeds. So that's one thing. It just facilitates the relationship. It doesn't help the tree out any if bird caches a bunch of hollow seeds. The other thing you'll notice is look at the shape of this pine cone. It looks very different than a lot of the pine cones you see in wind dispersed trees. For instance, the ponderosa pine cone, that's a wind dispersed seed. It's a little bitty seed with a big flange on the end that the wind hopefully blows somewhere that it can eventually possibly turn into a tree. Look at how the structure of that cone is such that it takes a lot of work to get those little seeds out of there, and squirrels and such do get in there and do that, but it's a lot of work. Think about this one. It looks more like a flower advertising those pinion nuts, just like a flower advertises pollen or nectar, and the pollen, helps it reproduce. These guys are opening up really easy to pick out those pinion nuts if you're a bird, because it just facilitates them being able to get those pinion nuts. So that's a really fun, very interesting symbiotic relationship between the jays and the pine cones and the pinion trees. So the last one we'll talk about is our three-way relationship between the ponderosa pines. And again, our Kaibab, this is going to be a Kaibab squirrel this time, of course. And then mycorrhizal fungi. And how this works is the fungus, they grow on the ends, their hyphae grow way extending very far beyond the roots of this is a bush, but pretend it's a tree. And by doing that, they have all this extensive root pattern that's connected to the roots of the tree. And how the fungi help the tree is that by having all those extended hyphae or root-like things, they can get much more water and bring it into the roots of the tree. So they're giving the tree water. They cannot make their own food. They're underground. They can't photosynthesize. The tree can, so it will make its own food and it will pass that nourishment, the sugars, on to the fungus. So the fungus helps the tree and the tree helps the fungus. As the fungus grows, it makes a big fruiting body called a truffle underground. This is the favorite food for the Kaibab squirrel, and they'll smell these and dig them out. And so let's look at how this relationship works. That's 3 ways. So here we have the tree, here we have the fungus. So the fungus gives the tree water, like we just mentioned. The tree then makes food and sends those nutrients to the fungus so it continues living. The fungus does so well, it eventually makes a truffle, a fruiting body. These are the squirrel's favorite food. They love these things. So they'll eat the truffle. The truffle go through his digestive tract, it'll eventually come out somewhere else. So they'll poop out spores from the truffles somewhere else, which distributes the spores to different areas so that it helps the fungus reproduce. So that's how the squirrel helps the fungus. Then the tree helps the squirrel by the squirrel also eats the seeds in the cone. It rips apart all those parts of the cone to get to those seeds. It eats the inner bark of the branches. And again, and so that's how the tree helps the squirrel. The squirrel helps the tree sort of in a roundabout way, in just that by it eating the spores and it distributes the spores, it helps the fungus reproduce and be in other places, which eventually helps the tree. So that's sort of a roundabout way. So you'll see that all 3 of those have, each one helps the other, and it's a sort of 3-way relationship. And the last one, which I'm not going to go into, but if you don't know about it, you should check it out and look online. There's a relationship between the yucca moth and the yucca plant. So that one also is fascinating. So maybe you haven't had homework for a while because you stopped going to school decades ago. So now you have a chance to have a homework assignment, and look up online tonight or whenever you want, yucca moth and yucca plant, symbiotic relationships, mutualistic relationships. Put in yucca plant and yucca moth and discover for yourself this really interesting interaction they have. The one thing I'll mention about it here is it's so intricate and so intertwined that the yucca plant cannot exist without the yucca moth, and the yucca moth cannot exist without the yucca plant. So that's one of many relationships that are out there. All of them, are fascinating, and I bet there's many relationships we do not know about that just happen without our knowing about it. We affect some of them unknowingly, not realizing what we're doing. That's another chapter in Grand Canyon's ecology, which we're not going to get into today. But we do now know just a little bit better what types of plants and animals we find in different sections, how they live in this Grand Canyon arid environment, and how sometimes they help each other out. So that is the end of the presentation. So I will stop my share.
Question?